The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. We all know this story thanks to Disney and that movie from 1999 that Johnny Depp was in, right? We know that this is a story from the 1790s about a man named Ichabod Crane. He was really tall, skinny, and goofy looking. Wait, that doesn't really describe Johnny Depp. So maybe he was average height? Okay looking, maybe? Kind of a serious personality? Ichabod was a New York City police officer.
I am Constable Ichabod Crane.
For some reason, before watching that movie from 1999, I thought Ichabod was a school teacher. Well, we know that Ichabod fell in love with a girl named Katrina Van Tassel. She was a flirty beauty who was fascinated with witchcraft. No, Ichabod was fascinated with witchcraft. Could they have both been fascinated with witchcraft? Crane enjoys chatting with the locals about stories of ghosts, goblins, and most especially the Headless Horseman. No. As I recall, Johnny Depp's Crane actually didn't believe the stories, and while he was in Sleepy Hollow, several people were killed by the Hessian soldier. Okay, well, for sure, we know that eventually Crane reunites the Headless Horseman with his head, thus allowing the apparition to finally find peace. No. That's not what I remember. Okay, so maybe we don't actually know the story, since Johnny Depp and Disney got some things wrong, or at least not right. How about we look at Washington Irving's story? Irving spends a lot of time on the setting. The story takes place in Tarrytown and nearby Sleepy Hollow. These are towns in Tappan Zee, in southeastern New York. Yes, these were, and still are, real towns in New York. The narrator of the story tells us this area is quiet. So quiet that when he was a young man and he shot his first squirrel, the sound and echo startled him. The narrator tells us there is a spell over the land. We're told this place is, quote, under the sway of some witching power, end quote. There is this strange dichotomy in Sleepy Hollow. On one hand, we're told that this is a nice, quiet, sleepy town where all of its inhabitants are idle daydreamers. On the other hand, this town is plagued with, quote, trances and visions, and frequently see strange sights and hear music and voices in the air. The dominant vision that pervades the area is, quote, the apparition of a figure on horseback without a head. And the specter is known at all of the country firesides by the name of the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow, end quote. Into this quiet, sleepy town comes our hero, Ichabod Crane. Our hero is tall and lanky. He has narrow shoulders, long arms that dangle out of his sleeves, and large flat feet. In addition, his head is flat at top. He has large green eyes. His huge ears and long snipe nose come together to where his head looks like a, quote, weathercock perched upon his spindle neck, end of quote. So, an interesting looking man. In spite of his goofy looking person, as a teacher, he's still a good potential suitor. Intellect is more important than outward appearance. One day, Ichabod comes upon something our narrator tells us is something much more perplexing than, quote, mortal man than ghosts, goblins, and the whole race of witches put together, end quote. What in the world could that be? Well, apparently, it's a woman. Yes, Ichabod comes across Katrina Van Tassel. She is a pretty lady who is quite a flirt. Ichabod sets his sights on her, and it kind of looks like maybe she set her sights on him too. One problem is that Katrina already has a suitor, Brom Bones. Bones is pretty much the opposite of Ichabod. He's muscular, handsome, and a bit childish. His physical prowess is unmatched in the area. Unfortunately for Ichabod, it turns out that Katrina was probably using Ichabod to make Brom jealous and probably push Brom into marriage. This is kind of a guess, though, because the narrator doesn't actually tell us this. He tells us he doesn't know what went on in the tete-a-tete between Ichabod and Katrina. All he knows is that when Ichabod quit her residence, he did so, quote, with an air quite desolate and chapfallen, end quote. This tete-a-tete occurred at the end of an evening of merriment at the Van Tassel house. Ichabod was invited by Katrina. He thought she liked him, and he was going to go there, profess his love for her, and she would profess hers to him. And then the two would decide to marry. This would mean that he would inherit the Van Tassel estate. Not that he was necessarily looking for that, but it was a great bonus to marrying Katrina. But instead, in that tete-a-tete, Ichabod seems to have gotten his heart broken. But during this evening, the revelers swapped stories about the ghostly antics of the area. Of course, the most interesting stories were related to the Headless Horseman. This evening happens about 3/4 of the way through the story. Up to this point, we've read a lot about the sleepy town, Ichabod's teaching skills, his interest in witchcraft, his musical talent, his love for food, his interest in Katrina, his coveting of her family farm, Brahm's antics to get Ichabod to leave Katrina alone, vague descriptions of the supernatural occurrences in the area. But what have we not seen much of? The Headless Horseman. I appreciate Irving's ability to spin a tale, but a little more of the main antagonist would have been nice. It's like watching a Godzilla movie and not seeing Godzilla until the end. Anyway, Ichabod mounts the steed he borrowed from Joost van Houten. Now imagine this tall, lanky man sitting atop this small horse. Quote, he rode with short stirrups, which brought his knees nearly up to the pommel of the saddle. His sharp elbows stuck out like grasshoppers. He carried his whip perpendicularly in his hand, like a scepter. And as his horse jogged along, the motion of his arms was not unlike the flapping of a pair of wings. Ichabod and his horse start their return home at midnight, a.k.a. the witching hour. On the ride back to Sleepy Hollow, Ichabod's thoughts return to the ghost stories told at the party. This is not unusual for our hero. He loves these stories. They also make him a little excited and frightened when out alone. As he approached this creepy tree, where a former resident was taken prisoner, it is clear that this night was different. The noises in the shadows were not just nature, and they put him on edge with not really much excitement. This night, instead of being a bystander hearing the ghost stories of Sleepy Hollow, he is a participant. Then he came upon a stream where locals say is haunted. He wanted to get across this makeshift bridge as quickly as he can. At first, Gunpowder, that's his horse, hesitated, which didn't help Ichabod with his nerves. Then he gave Gunpowder some harsh kicks. But Gunpowder, instead of going across the bridge, turns and runs along the side of the stream instead. When Gunpowder stopped, Ichabod nearly went head first over the horse. Then came the apparition. At first, Ichabod wasn't sure who it was, but then the light of the night illuminated him. Ichabod could see this was indeed the ghostly horseman who haunts the area. Ichabod was even more frightened when he saw that the horseman's head was in his pommel rather than on his shoulders. Ichabod was not a skillful rider, as you can imagine, but he had to muster up everything he had to try to outrun the cloaked monster. Ichabod and his starveling scampered off in the most inartful way, trying to escape the Hessian soldier. As I said, Ichabod was not a skillful rider, and so when he left the Van Tassels, he failed to check the girth on his saddle to ensure that it was cinched well. This failure gives us a nice image of him riding Gunpowder, and his saddle starts to slip toward the back of the horse. Eventually, the saddle drifted to the backside of the horse, and Ichabod found himself there too. Now, since Ichabod is so tall, this might not have been so uncomfortable for him. I cannot say the same for that dainty nag, though. In spite of his efforts, the saddle slides off the side of the horse, and Ichabod is forced to hang on to Gunpowder's neck. We get a little comic relief because Ichabod at times slips from one side of the horse to the other while hanging on for dear life. They near the church and bridge that was mentioned in so many of the stories Ichabod heard. He hoped safety was within reach. However, at this time, quote, he heard the black steed panting and blowing close behind him. He even fancied that he felt his hot breath. End quote. Ichabod kicked Gunpowder and they dashed across the bridge. Believing they were safe based on the stories he'd heard, Ichabod looks back to confirm the horseman was not continuing pursuit. Instead, to his fright, Ichabod sees the Hessian at nearly a standing position in his stirrups. Then the horseman hurls his disembodied head directly at Ichabod. The ghastly's ghost aim was precise, and his head slammed into Ichabod's head, knocking Ichabod off his horse. Gunpowder and the apparition ride off. Ichabod's hat and a broken pumpkin were found together near the bridge, but Ichabod was never seen again. Some think the galloping Hessian got him. Others had heard that he ran away out of fear of the ghosts and his humiliation from what happened with Katrina. We're left to decide for ourselves.